Professional Santas, Christmas performers, Santa portrayal artists. These are all synonyms of the same idea, the guy behind the red suit and the beard that's a symbol of the Christmas holiday. And whether you believe he's real,
Santa's coming to town! Santa! I know him!
Or not,
how can one man, in one night, visit all the children of the world?
it is undeniable that Santa Claus is a major part of the human experience.
My picture will be on mantelpieces of people I don't even know.
And while the American version of Santa has impacted the globe, the origins of this story and character are ancient.
You got to remember that the archetype of Santa Claus has been going back to the winter gift giver, which predates Christ by 2,000 to 4,000 years, depending what sources you look at.
Professional Santas can be found all over the world.
I'm going to enter Jerusalem on the camel.
Ho, ho, Holy Land! Ho, ho, ho!
And I think he is an emblem of goodness, of course. So I'm very strongly in favor of Father Christmas, both in Narnia and here.
And they come in all shapes and sizes, colors and creeds.
I've had 80-year-old women of different hues say with tears in their eyes, I've never seen a black Santa before.
They attend meetups and schools and invest in their education. And they do it all to bring us something more than just presents under a tree.
A lot of weight in faith, a lot of weight in hope, there's a lot of weight in love, and so there's a lot of weight in joy.
I hope you've been good this year, because Santa Claus is coming to town. I'm Leslie. It's nice to meet you. And this is Santa Portrayal Artistry. Okay, let's address the big question right away. Some of you might be listening with children. If the realness of Santa is a major concern in your household, perhaps you might want to skip ahead, or maybe not even listen at all. I hope you will, because there's a lot to learn through these professional Santas that, I believe, make Christmas even more magical. We'll talk to a lot of Santas in this series, all of them real, by the way. Rest assured, I've vetted them personally. If you're open to the idea of a different way to think about Santa, one that doesn't hinge so much on the realness of one person, keep listening. So, the million-dollar question, is Santa Claus real?
Would you please tell her that you're not really Santa Claus?
Well, I'm sorry to disagree with you, Mrs. Walker, but not only is there such a person, but here I am to prove it.
No, you misunderstand. I want you to tell her the truth.
The truth? Santa Claus is real. Final answer. But maybe not in the way we've been trained to think.
When you believe in Santa, you don't believe in me. You believe in a spirit.
That's Santa Ben. He's a Middle Tennessee Santa who started fairly recently. 2023 was his first year. He is a classic-looking Santa, perfectly groomed white mustache and fluffy beard. A contrast to someone like, say, Santa Robert, who's Norwegian, Jewish, one of about 1,500 Jews in Norway. Robert and I met while he was in the U.S. for the International Santa Celebration, which is like SantaCon, and you'll hear a lot more about it later. Santa Robert is surprised by the American approach to the person of Santa.
There's a big difference because here, are you the real Santa? We don't have this question because Santas in Norway are everywhere. You have forest Santas, mountain Santas, barn Santas, and this thing about Santa being in a red suit, or it's something that we've imported from the United States. We never had that.
Yes, we're thinking about Santa all wrong. Could it be that we've done a disservice to ourselves by making Santa so literal? And maybe we would be better off considering Santa as something else, something bigger? I propose this theory, and we've adopted it for our own household because the realness of Santa Claus isn't in the literal flesh and blood of a single person. The realness is in the spirit of the character itself, and that is the story we'll tell about these professional Santas in this miniseries. I want to invite us, over the course of the telling of the professional Santa story, to imagine a different landscape. That by recognizing the realness of every Santa, we actually understand the whole point of the exercise even better. For all our imagining, making Santa literally real, in the sense of him being a single person, has actually hampered our imaginations. It seems counterintuitive. Some might assume that imagination exists to steal us from reality and escape and out, dissociating. But this is missing the point altogether. And by studying the Santa niche, we discover why. So now the question becomes, who is the deliverer of presents on Christmas Eve, and how do they do it? This question brings with it implications about the deliverer of the gifts, the magic of visiting all the houses in one night, the mysterious ability to enter homes without fireplaces, the unimaginable task of carrying all the presents in one sleigh. Movies have offered solutions, tech-enhanced sleighs, Mary Poppins-like gift bags. The crew from Sesame Street even poses these sorts of existential questions about Santa Claus.
What happens, though, if Santa cannot get down the chimney, cannot get to the door, it is locked, and cannot get in the window because the window is locked, and he will never bring the presents ever again? What happens?
I don't know.
Right. We don't know. What do we do with that? What do the real Santas themselves offer folks when they ask? What's the explanation from the experts? Here's one from Santa Shed, who you'll meet later in the series.
If you've been around a bunch of Santas, they'll tell you how we solve that issue. You know, these are my brothers. Only one of us gets to be Santa each year. And we typically don't know until right before Christmas Eve who gets to be the real Santa this year. So when we say we know, he knows when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake. When we see everything, it's not because there's one Santa that sees everything. There's millions of us all over the world, and we're all watching. How can I see what's happening in a time zone that's 8 hours away? Because my brother's there.
Yes, there are millions of them around the world. It's a large niche that's alive and it's thriving. And in order to understand it, we first have to gain an understanding of the character they portray. Though the person of Santa is associated with a season that we now understand to be tied to a holiday with Christian origin, it wasn't always this way. In fact, the Santa we see at the mall now represents thousands of years of traditions from many different cultures around wintertime. A casserole of traditions, if you will, a crock pot. But it starts with a little Scandinavian gnome.
The basis of the Santa thing is Norse, it's Scandinavian. It started way back before Christianity came.
This is Santa Robert again, whose own tradition of Santa in Norway is perhaps the most historic and long-standing.
The little gnome that no one saw, but everyone knew was there, was the house or farm or homestead deity. This gnome thing or being was looking after the animals, making sure everything was good, and they sacrificed to this being.
So there's the beginning idea. It's a mysterious deity who keeps watch over your estate. Now, at the same time, there's a tradition of wintertime merriment among agricultural people, a natural time for celebration after a long season of planting and sowing and harvesting. Here's church historian Stephanie Fulbright.
Wintertime is the season of fresh meat in agricultural societies. It's when the year's supply of beer and wine is ready. So there's, from a sort of agricultural crop cycle standpoint, these were kind of the times where everything went a little bit topsy-turvy. In these agricultural societies, the poor are paying the rich some sort of monies owed or in-kind goods owed. So this time of giving is an inversion of that social norm. It was a time when the rich gave to the poor.
And then Christianity entered the picture. The origins of Christmas on December 25th aren't necessary to understand Santa. It involves councils and the church calendar and feast days and hundreds of years of cultural traditions, but we do see a convergence of all the things in the Roman Empire.
So there's a tradition within the Roman world around a holiday on December 25th. It was part of the Roman winter festival season. And in 567 at the Council of Tours, we finally get a setting of Christmas as December 25th.
And it was at that point that the Scandinavians start adapting the lore of their benevolent gnome.
And then came Christianity. Of course, it wasn't good to have this deity in your house. So they put him out in the barn. That's where he stayed. So he still looked after the animals and whatnot, and they sacrificed to him. Although they didn't call it sacrifice, they put up porridge and whatnot on Christmas. And that's where this thing started.
Lifelong professional Santa and historian Phil Wentz, whose expertise in this niche stands alone, you'll hear from him a lot in this series, he ties the barn gnome to the larger tradition of the winter gift giver.
The culture behind that, you got to remember that the archetype of Santa Claus has been going back to the winter gift giver, which predates Christ by 2,000 to 4,000 years, depending what sources you look at. So there's always been a tradition around the holiday season or the winter season about this gift giver that gave out gifts to the mortals.
Okay, so let's recap before moving on. This is a lot of information. Before the coming of Christ, agricultural societies had used the dark winter season that follows their hard-working harvest time to let loose, enjoy the fruits of their labor. And as people are oft to do, they developed stories rooted in existential questions about provision and safety, which led to the concept of a benevolent figure to accompany their wintertime celebrations. Enter Saint Nicholas, a 4th century Roman bishop.
He was known as this great defender of the faith and of orthodoxy. There's also a story of him helping out a man who had 3 daughters and didn't have enough money for the dowry to marry his daughters off. And so Nicholas dropped off a bag of gold in secret. Nicholas becomes to be known as the patron saint of sailors and merchants, repentant thieves and prostitutes, children, brewers, pawnbrokers, and students.
My goodness, that's a very vast community of people.
Yeah, a wide swath of folks that he's looking out for, but the big ones here is going to be children.
Throughout Europe, St. Nicholas and his gift-giving and children-watching and faith-defending congeal with the other various traditions and evolve.
So there's a Old Man Winter in Finland, Father Christmas in England. All of these names that we have that kind of become Santa Claus, they are a old man figure who's doing things in December who becomes associated with Nicholas.
So here's a fun combination of all the traditions. In the Netherlands, a figure named Sinterklaas would visit once a year and quiz children and adults on Bible trivia. If you passed the impromptu Bible quiz, you would get a little gift. If not, you would either get beaten or put in a bag and taken to hell by Black Pete, Saint Nick's evil assistant. We will not be exploring Black Pete any further. And then the Protestant church, not at all interested in things like saints and other Catholic constructs, adds another ingredient to the crockpot of the Santa stew.
And so Protestant Germany then has this conundrum. In some ways, this is kind of a beloved tradition. So you can't just get rid of St. Nicholas altogether, but you can't keep him because he's Catholic. So instead, they introduce the idea of Christkindl, or the Christ child, who visits children on Christmas Eve, and it spiritualizes gift giving, right?
At this point, you've probably noticed the breadcrumbs of our own accepted modern-day Santa lore. Leaving treats out at night, his ever-present watch over us, the origins of the many names of the character like Kris Kringle, Santa Claus, St. Nick. But for Santa to make his final evolution into the character we now know and love, he had to come to America.
Well, generally what happens is there's an immigration of both Dutch and German folks into New York. And the English-speaking folks have, a lot of these words are unfamiliar to them and they haven't heard them before. So Christkindl starts to sound like Kris Kringle, and Sinterklaas, which is St. Nicholas, becomes Santa Claus.
And then there's a poem that goes viral.
The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads.
Attorney and Santa historian Tom German has written 2 large volumes on the history of the character, one of which is focused directly on the single most important factor to understanding today's Santa.
2 books or poems were written in 1821 and 1823 that set forth all of the details that we've come to interpret as Santa Claus.
The first was in a book published by William Gilly that included a poem called Old Santy Claus with Much Delight. Though there's not much delight in his rendering of the character of Santa, here's a bit of the poem. Where'er I found good girls or boys that hated quarrels, strife, and noise, I left an apple or a tart, or wooden gun or painted cart. No drums to stun their mother's ear, nor swords to make their sisters fear, but pretty books to store their mind with knowledge of each various kind. But where I found the children naughty, in manners crude and temper haughty, thankless to parents, liars, swearers, boxers or cheats, or base tale bearers, I left a long black birchen rod, such as the dread command of God directs a parent's hand to use when virtue's path his sons refuse. Yeesh. 2 years later, a writer named Clement Moore decided to write his own poem. Clement Moore's father was not only the Columbia College president, but an Episcopal bishop in New York. Their estate was called Chelsea. It's the same Chelsea we now know of as a prominent neighborhood on the west side of Manhattan. Clement is a frustrating character. He was a theologian of sorts, but he also fought for slavery to keep those enslaved who were maintaining the Chelsea property. He himself had 9 children, 3 of whom did not make it to adulthood. His wife died young, left him a single father. So this poem he wrote for his children on Christmas Eve was his take on the character developed by William Gilley.
Someone who was at his house on Christmas Eve took a copy of it without his permission and gave it to the newspaper editor in Troy. He published it. Over time, became really the description of how we celebrate Christmas.
That poem was called A Visit from St. Nicholas, which we know now as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas.
When what to my wondering eye should appear but a miniature sleigh. And Eddie, with a man in his pajamas and a dog chain tied to his wrists and ankles. What the? Stay here.
There is one more central figure to the Santa lore, and his name is Thomas Nast.
Thomas Nast is a German-born illustrator who's moved to New York, and he's the one who's going to give us a lot of the images, the visual images of what we associate with Santa Claus today.
Nast worked for Harper's Weekly, and he plays an important role in American pop culture. He came up with the donkey and elephant for the political parties. He drew Uncle Sam and a lot of other famous wartime imagery, and he's how we visualize the Santa figure.
So "Twas Night Before Christmas" told us that Santa had chubby cheeks and a red nose, but the pot-bellied, white-bearded gentleman with a sack over his shoulder in kind of a red uniform with white trim is coming from Thomas Nast.
He starts publishing these illustrations about 40 years after Clement's poem takes off. He does 33 of them, and included are some of the things we consider central to the Santa lore.
So headquarters in the North Pole, the fact that he's a toy maker, that there's elves, that he receives letters, that he has his ledger of names, the idea of giving cookies for Santa, all come out of Thomas Nast's illustrations.
There's even an instance in which Thomas Nast brings together his political cartoons with Santa and puts Santa in a Union uniform. So if you thought Santa was apolitical, think again. Coca-Cola used Nast's images for their advertising starting in the 1920s, and in 1930, illustrator Haddon Sundblom's Santa was drinking bottles of Coke in the Saturday Evening Post. And that, kids, is how Santa came to town. But we aren't a history podcast, and this isn't a series about Santa himself. It's about the ones who portray him. And the history of Kris Kringle is certainly the origin of this niche. It'll help paint the full picture of why folks who embody this character do it at all. The conglomerated figure of Santa matters a great deal, and we'll talk more about that in the third and final episode of this series, but how did Santa, the character, manifest into a niche subculture built on the portrayal of the character, with meetups and continuing education and an entire industry? That's where we'll pick up the story right after this break. Stay with us. Hey, listener. I want to take a quick break to say 3 things. First, I want to thank you for your listening time. We all have so many things we want to catch up on, especially at a time of year when all the best of lists are coming out. And yes, I did listen to Hysterical, and don't even get me started on the new season of Serial. I love that whale. So thank you. It's an honor you've chosen this show for 90 minutes of your precious time. Number 2, I hope you've stuck around because you like it. If so, consider joining our email list. Social media is not the place to connect like it used to be, and we have some big plans for next year we want to loop you in on. Find that in our show notes. 3, finally, we'd love to have a friendship with you. If you send us a short email to say where you are and what brought you to the show, we'll send a joke back, like a really good one. In fact, we have a whole intern devoted to writing them, and the jokes are just sitting there, waiting for someone to hear them. That person could be you. Email us right now, hello@nichetomeetyou.show. We look forward to hearing from you. Phil Wentz is a lifelong Santa, and by that I mean he's been Santa since before he can remember, and it's been his entire career. Put on his first suit at age 4, was in his first parade at 14, and at 23, he became the Santa at Santa's Village theme park in Dundee, Illinois, a post he still holds to this day.
I think I've been in over 65 parades, which is a lot. And it's like this year, I just finished my 38th year on the property of Santa's Village being Santa Claus, year round.
Phil is also an expert on the history of being Santa. He's a charter member of the International Santa Claus Hall of Fame in Santa Claus, Indiana. It's a real place. He's interviewed for documentaries. He's flown across the country for appearances. He's even an artifact collector, and he's restoring the sleigh used in the remake of the Miracle on 34th Street film. And Phil can trace his own niche back to the very beginning, when the first real-life Santa made an appearance at Parkinson's department store in Philadelphia in the 1890s. It was a publicity stunt. Nobody sat on any laps, he just stood in the window.
The trail of Santa Claus really didn't start till the 1890s in Brockton, Massachusetts, the department store there. Then James Brockton became the first department store Santa.
The first Santa Claus parade happened in Peoria, Illinois about that same time. So that's technically when the culture started, but it never really came to life until the 1920s. The end of World War I provided an opportunity for celebration as families were reuniting and celebrating Christmas together in peacetime. Evidently, the need for in-person Santas was so great that patterns were made for the red suits. When this happened, the culture exploded among families and small communities, especially in fire stations.
They actually had a course in how to play Santa Claus in fire stations. That
Fire
was kind of like the
stations
community.
specifically for like firefighters, that was their...
Exactly. That was their deal. That's why a lot of the Santas in the beginning had white belts, because the belts were white, the firefighters' coats.
Okay.
Okay? So there's a whole culture around that.
But what started as a grassroots movement among families and communities soon began to develop into a formal, organized industry, starting with an apple farmer in Albion, New York, named Charles W. Howard, known as the Dean of Santa Clauses, another lifelong Santa like Phil.
He played Santa Claus in the 4th grade because as a heavyset kid, he was chubby, so they made him Santa Claus. Well, he started kind of like doing this. And so a friend of his at Ackerman's department store, I believe it was in Albion, he asked Charlie if he'd dress up like Santa Claus and sit in the window. And that was around 1935-ish. And his portrayal was so good that people started saying, hey, you ought to teach other guys how to do this. And so a department store in Rochester hired him, and the mold was set because he was head and shoulders above all these other Santas. And so he really started studying. Now, he was also involved in theater. He loved to build displays. He worked in the Orleans County fairs. So he had all this different type of skill sets. He also had a coping saw as a child so he could make toys. So he kind of put all this stuff together, and he got, if Santa's going to be real, how do you make him real? So by studying not only the acting part of it, but the presentation part of it.
He created the first established Santa Claus school with a novel approach, understanding the psychology of children, focusing on the recipient of the portrayal instead of simply the presentation alone or for marketing. It was through this that he met Carl Harris from Santa Claus, Indiana. Now, the origins of this place are kind of murky. The town was originally called Santa Fe, but since there was already a Santa Fe, Indiana, the post office told residents to decide on a new name. One legend tells that during a town meeting, the wind burst open the doors and the children shouted, "Santa Claus!" and thus Santa Claus, Indiana was supposedly born. They owned this moniker and opened a Santa Claus Town theme park owned by Carl Harris.
Harris had all the connections with different type of department stores, dry goods stores and stuff like that through Indiana area, from Vincennes all the way to Indianapolis, down to Spencer County where Santa Claus, Indiana is. They put together the school together, and they had 3 sessions at $150 a piece, 10 people in each session. That's a lot of money back in 1938. And so what happened is that these department stores sent executives to learn how to be Santa Claus so they could teach it in their own stores.
Now, I've learned that with any niche worth its salt, there's drama. And this is no exception.
Well, Howard was on newsreels, going all over the place. And he was actually going to move from Albion, New York to Santa Claus, Indiana, and set up the school permanently. At the same time, a guy named Carl Barrett from the AAA Motor Club in Chicago came down and bought property across from Milt Harris and put up Santa Claus Park. And so they tried to outdo each other. Lawsuits prevailed, and Howard said, I'm not going to deal with all these lawsuits. He goes back to Albion, New York, and sets the school back up there in 1939.
And there it stayed until the 1960s when it moved to Bay City, Michigan. And it's still active there to this day. Howard not only started the education of being Santa, but he's also part of a rich history of the prowess of the major city department store Santa. And something worth spending some time on, the Macy's Santa. Howard became the parade Santa for Macy's in 1948, and he retained that role until 1965. Helping to build the monstrosity and the legacy of what we now know as the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
The first Thanksgiving Day Parade was not in New York. It was actually in Philadelphia. 2 years later, Detroit and New York started Thanksgiving Day parades. So they were all pretty well equal until the movie Miracle on 34th Street came out.
This movie put Macy's parade head and shoulders above the rest. It was that movie that made the parade what it is.
Because Edmund Gwenn actually portrayed Santa in the parade. That was filmed live in location. This mystique about Macy's really came into being.
If you ask a professional Santa about the Macy's Santa, you'll get a chuckle. The air might even become a little tense, especially if you're a journalist obviously looking for answers. It's a lot like the idea of Banksy, where the general public delights in the notion that it's one person, but it's likely several. And the ones actually making the pieces of art may be known to some, but those folks aren't ever going to divulge the artist's identity. Yeah, the Macy's Santa, it's the same vibe. There's secrecy, but there's also mystique because most folks don't know who he is, even though he might walk among them at a Santa meetup. But some do, like Phil.
So the Santas, even though I know who the guy is, I've talked to him, and a few other guys in the community know who he is. It's one of those things where he's Macy's and he doesn't do anything else. He's tight-lipped about it. And that's just the way they want it.
Now, Phil's never done the Macy's parade, but he's done others, 65 of them, you heard. And I wondered what that experience was like.
You look at the canyon of skyscrapers around you, and it's just like you see in New York or Detroit or Philadelphia, your big old city downtowns with fantastic architecture. You have the live music, and you're coming up and you can see every unit in front of you going up the street. And you can see tons of these balloons, and you get the floats and the band. It's an aura, but at the same time, you're there to entertain that crowd. It's not about you, it's about entertaining them. It's also in a big parade like that, if you're on top of your game, you know who's in the crowd, where they're located at in the VIP section, so you can make eye contact with them because they're paying for this parade. And so that's part of the politics of that. It's just not sitting there waiting. That's the least of the worries. The worry is entertaining the camera. You're playing audiences of people on the street, people on television, and the sponsorship themselves. So there's a lot of responsibility with that. That's why when you get something like that, if you're good, they stick with you for a long time.
It is so fun to talk to someone like Phil, a historian who rattles off names and places and accomplishments like they're common knowledge. That's what I love about these niches. People like him are everywhere. I especially loved when he started talking about the infamous Santas like Jim Yellick,
who worked with the American Legion to write letters back to children, the Letters from Santa Claus program in Santa Claus, Indiana.
Or how about James D. Riley?
Now, he was a Santa for almost 60 years. He did orphanages, military bases, and all that kind of stuff.
Then there's Bill Strother,
who was the world's highest paid Santa, according to Saturday Evening Post. He was making thousands of dollars a week playing Santa Claus in the 40s. He was the first guy that had transistors, earpieces in where parents could talk in a booth and tell Santa what the kids needed for Christmas or they're bad or good.
So if you haven't been keeping up, we've got
Charles W. Howard, Albion, New York. Jim Yellick, Santa Claus, Indiana. Bill Strother, Richmond, Virginia. And James D. Riley, which would be Bristol, Rhode Island. Now you built this Mount Rushmore of the 4 historic Santas. And everything that we kind of do today stem off those 4 guys. Everybody stands on their shoulders.
When Phil says everybody, he's referring to other Santa portrayal artists or other Christmas performers, professional Santas. The ones who attend the C.W. Howard School in Michigan, the ones who spend thousands of dollars on suits and boots, and the ones who face the heaviness of the grief of humanity head on.
It's a very powerful art form, and a lot of people dismiss it because oftentimes it's taken very topical or it can be done very badly. But when you have somebody who actually walks the walk and believes with their heart that they're there for their fellow human beings, it is powerful beyond belief.
So, knowing the origins of this niche, it actually matters because the rest of the story we'll tell is built on it. That's why we took a different approach for this series of episodes, started at the beginning. It's important to know who the character is and the history of the tradition of portraying him, because next, we meet the folks behind the beard, the ones who stand on the shoulders of those Mount Rushmore professional Santa Clauses. You'll hear some of their own motivations for the work they do tirelessly every year.
Excitement, awe, wonder, it's all these things combined. You touch people, it does something to them.
And you'll come with me as I meet a Santa who, every year, visits the same group of kids at his school, especially for children with low vision.
Can you feel my beard? You feel my beard?
You'll even come with me to a Santa meetup and a convention where Santas flock for community, education, and celebration. All this and more on the next episode of Niche to Meet You and our 3-part series about professional Santas. Niche to Meet You is an independent audio project created and reported by me, Leslie Thompson. Chris Thiessen is our associate script editor. The theme music is by Abigail Flowers, and the arrangement you hear under you right now is by Mike Hicks. Our artwork is designed by Rachel Hardiker, and these episodes were mastered by Kevin Morris. Tell us what your favorite part of this episode was by emailing us at hello@nichetomeetyou.show.